welcome to Nazarene, Israel. My name is Norman Willis, and I'm the apostle for the restoration of the original first century faith. And in this part 5 of Revelation Simplified, we want to talk about trumpets 1 through 6. And this is where we begin to start talking about the events of the tribulation per se. So there's a lot of information here to help keep things oriented. We're going to talk about the parable of the pregnant bride. And this is just an analogy that Yahweh gave me to help people stay oriented or stay focused on what's happening. So during the seals, we know we know that we are his bride, and we know that we received the deposit of the Spirit in the first century in Acts chapter 2. And so the seals, if we're willing to accept it, simply represent a bride's growing burden, such as the pregnant bride bears a growing burden over 9 months or 40 weeks. And this corresponds to the period in time, the almost 2,000 years, where the 4 horse forces are marshaling the nations and the armies of the world, getting them ready for the events of the tribulation. Now the trumpets, as we're going to see trumpets 1 through 6 in these slides, this slide set, these are the brides, this begins the tribulation. So they're analogous to the contractions or the labor pains beginning for the bride. So we take a look at the simplified timeline chart. Second row down is the 7 seals. We saw seals 1 through 4 was the releasing of 4 horse forces. Seal 5 was the events at 9/11. So the martyrs cry out for justice. They're given a white robe, told to wait a little while longer. And these things continue to go on. Then at seal 6, we see the sky recede like a scroll, and every island and mountain is moved out of its place, meaning every national border and every government is going to change. And then we're going to see the rise of a new world order system. And then a half an hour of silence in heaven. It's going to continue on for 20 years that way before we begin to get into the tribulation. So the Club of Rome has planned for the rise of what are called the 10 supernations. And these may correspond to the 10 toes of the Babylonian New World Order system. It's simply 10 geographic regions that will be controlled effectively by Rome. So if we take a look, if we're talking about 10 toes, we're talking about what happens in the feet. But before we talk about the feet, let's talk about what happens in the head. So we saw before that the rabbinical order was created in Babylon, and that's why we say rabbinic Judah remains in the head of the Babylonian New World Order system. Then we saw Esau, which is, he's a secular, he's not theocratic, but he's secular. He believes in democracy. This is the glue that holds the whole Babylonian New World Order together, is Roman style, a Greco-Roman style democracy. Then we saw the 2 feet of iron mixed with miry clay. This is to where the 10 toes belong. So we have the Western foot, which is Western-style Christianity, and the Eastern foot is Eastern-style Christianity. Western-style Christianity, Western Roman Christianity would be Catholicism and Protestantism. Eastern Roman Christianity would correspond to Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, and Coptic, or we might say Coptic Orthodox Christianity. Western Rome is also allied with Sunni Islam, and Eastern Rome is also allied with Shia Islam. So it gets, we'll talk more about that as we progress forward. But now we're going to begin in this slide set to get into the 7 trumpets. So this is after seal 7. We have a half hour of silence in heaven. Now we're going to see 7 trumpets. And in this slide set, we're going to talk about trumpets 1 through 6. And then just to keep people oriented, there's a lot of information here. Trumpets 1 through 6. Then we're going to see the inset column, second column from the right. After this, we'll talk in the next slide set about the 2 witnesses, and then we'll talk about the great societal quake that takes place at trumpet 7, which is when Babylon falls. But we'll get to that in more detail. Again, a lot of information takes place here. We're going to be able to talk about a portion of the information that takes place during the trumpets during this slide set. So to keep people oriented, we're looking at a 7-year time frame for the trumpets or the tribulation. Now, the tribulation, some people also include the cups into Armageddon. I wouldn't argue with that. But we're talking about a 7-year tribulation per se, or 7 years for the trumpets. And during the trumpets, we're talking about destruction by thirds. And in the second half of the tribulation, so we still see destruction by thirds, but things get worse in the second half. So the second half is also what we call the time of Jacob's trouble. Now, additionally, there's 3 woes. We'll see the first 2 woes in this slide set. There's also 7 thunders, which we'll see in a future slide set. We're also going to see the 144,000 again. This is also when the daily sacrifice is taken away. An abomination that makes desolate is set up. We're also going to see that the 2 witnesses are killed at trumpet 7. So there's a lot of information that takes place here, and much of it culminates at trumpet 7. So we're just going to keep adding information and keep bringing you back to this timeline, trying to help you understand and assimilate how everything fits together. So to recap, so we see the opening prelude for the trumpets at Revelation chapter 8 and verse 1. We saw this in the last slide set also. It says, "And when the Lamb had opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven for about a half an hour." Now, the New World Order government is likely already set up at this point, but now they have what we might say is 20 years and 10 months to raise a new generation in the New World Order. I chose to go over these options again. We had some questions about what exactly the half hour of silence means. It could be a literal half hour of silence, but it doesn't make a lot of sense during the context because it would barely show up as a blip on the radar screen. If we use a day for a year, as in Ezekiel 4, that only corresponds to 7.5 days. Again, doesn't make a lot of sense given the timeline. Or if we use the principle of a day for 1,000 years, as found in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 8, we're talking about a span of 20 years and 10 months where the New World Order is set up. And so we have a new generation being raised in this New World Order where there's a peace that is no peace upon the earth, but basically no major global events happening. So we come to Revelation 8 and verse 2, things are going to begin to change. The half hour of silence is over, 20 years and 10 months come to a close. It says, "And I saw the 7 messengers who stand before Elohim, and to them were given 7 trumpets." Verse 3, "Then another angel or another messenger, having a golden censer, came and stood at the altar. He was given much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne." And when a new world order is set up, you will hear a lot of prayers from the saints. And it says, in verse 4, continuing, it says, "And the smoke of the incense, with the prayers of the saints, ascended before Elohim from the messenger's hand. Then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and threw it to the earth. And there were noises, thunderings, lightnings, and an earthquake." And when we talk about an earthquake, Revelation is such a highly symbolic book. What we're really talking about here is a social quake or a societal quake. We're talking about a shakeup in the New World Order. So a New World Order has arisen. It's been peaceful, more or less, for 20 years and 10 months. But now things are going to begin to change as the New World Order begins to fall apart. So they've set up the New World Order based upon selfishness and greed, where the masses of people serve the elites and not the other way around. That kind of a self-serving thing can only last for so long, and then it's going to begin to fall apart, which is what we're going to begin to see in this slide series. So we come to verse 6. It says, "So the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound." And we know that Yeshua says there's going to be a lot of activity going on here. It says, "For then there will be great tribulation, such has not been since the beginning of the world until this time. No, nor ever shall be." That's Matthew chapter 24 and verse 21. So the first messenger sounded, Revelation 8 and verse 7. The first messenger sounded, and hail and fire followed, mingled with blood, and they were thrown to the earth. And 1/3 of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. And we need to talk about the symbolism here. Normally we use the Greek texts for textual analysis because most scholars believe that the Greek texts are older. However, there is a counter-argument that the Aramaic Peshitta is older, just that it was modified or redacted later, and that's a long story. We're undecided on that. We don't know. But the Peshitta reads water. So in the event that the Peshitta reading is accurate, and we have hail and fire mingled with water, this may represent a comet, because that's basically what most comets are, is a large, basically frozen slush ball that also is, there's fire to it because it's moving so fast, some of the slush is vaporized and actually burned. But when it's thrown to earth, it says a third of the trees were burned up and all green grass was burned up. Some people ask, there is that one passage where the Yeshua heals the eyes of the blind man, and he says, I see men like trees walking. We don't believe that the trees here are symbolic of men. We believe that they're symbolic of trees, and probably symbolic of trees in the Middle Eastern region, although it could spill over to the whole world. But the reason we believe that is because later on, when we get to trumpet 6, we'll see a third of mankind be killed. So we don't see how it makes sense to call mankind trees here and then call mankind at trumpet 6. So if that will continue. Revelation 8 and verse 8, and then the second messenger sounded, and something like a great mountain or a great government burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood. Verse 3, and a third of the living creatures in the sea died. This may refer to the Mediterranean. And a third of the ships were destroyed. Then the third messenger sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. And people ask quite often, they say, where does Nibiru fit into this? And Nibiru is actually a rabbinic doctrine. But again, rabbinic Judah is in the head of Babylon. We know that Babylon is in contact with the forces of the occult. So they may have prior knowledge of something that we don't. So if there is a Nibiru or Planet X, and there may very well be a Planet X or a Nibiru, this here at Trumpet 3 is one of the places where it may manifest. And it says the name of the star is, verse 11, it says the name of the star is wormwood. And a third of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the water because it was made bitter. So now the question becomes, what exactly are we talking about here with this symbolism? The symbolism in the trumpets is particularly difficult. It's one of the most difficult symbologies that we have. But wormwood is a very bitter plant. It's technically it's a medicinal bitter plant. And it can make water bitter. But we also know that water can symbolize the Spirit, and it can also symbolize doctrine. So if we are willing to take a look at a spiritual interpretation, so Yeshua was sacrificed on a tree, and his sacrifice was very bitter. And we're going to see that in Exodus, a tree is thrown into bitter waters in order to make them sweet. And we know that Yeshua tells us, or Yeshua told his disciples on the way to Emmaus, that everything written in the Torah is written about him, effectively. So we go to Exodus 15, and starting in verse 22. And it says, so Moshe brought Israel from the Reed Sea. Then they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. Verse 23. Now when they came to Marah, they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it was called Marah, which means bitter. And the people complained against Moshe, saying, what shall we drink? So he cried out to Yahweh, and Yahweh showed him a tree. Then he cast it into the waters, and the waters were made sweet. So if we look at the possible symbolism could be that just like Yeshua's sacrifice on a tree was very bitter, but it made the waters of the Spirit sweet, if the world turns to a one-world religion, or a first beast, or it's also called the United Religions Initiative, this basically is going to turn people away from the true Yeshua and that would make the waters of the Spirit bitter. So again, if belief on Yeshua and receiving Yeshua's Spirit makes the waters of the Spirit sweet, turning away from Yeshua, the waters might go back to being bitter. That's a possible spiritual interpretation of this. Continuing on to verse 12. Then the fourth messenger sounded, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them were darkened. A third of the day did not shine, and likewise the night. So again, taking a look at the spiritual aspects of this, it's one hypothesis is that in the natural, in the physical, we're talking about a nuclear winter. But there's a spiritual hypothesis here. We've already seen in previous slide sets that the sun can represent Yeshua's Spirit. That would be representative of Joseph and the Christian people. If a third of them became darkened, a third of them might fall away. The moon represents the Torah and the commandments, which Brother Judah follows. Again, if a third of them are darkened, a third of the Jews might fall away. And the stars would represent Abraham's seed. And we know that Abraham's seed were to be as numerous as the stars of the heavens and the sand of the seashore. And at the time this was given, Ishmael was the son. So what this means is that a third of Abraham's descendants might fall away as a result of this fourth trumpet. We don't know that, but this is what we see as a strong possible interpretation. So continuing to verse 13, it says, "And I looked, and I heard a messenger flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, 'Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because the remaining blasts of the trumpet of the three angels who are about to sound.'" So the thing that's important to understand about this is we've just seen the first four trumpets. And as bad as these first four trumpets are, they're not yet bad enough to qualify as woes. Trumpets 5, 6, and 7, those are going to qualify as woes. So what's happening here is that Yahweh is progressively stepping up the level of punishment in order to get people to repent and to turn back to him and to keep his commandments. So from this point forward, now we're starting to get, one might think, into the second half of the trumpet sequence. And this is where we may begin to see some overlap into the time of Jacob's trouble, but we don't know that. Right now we're just laying down a foundation of what happens at the first 6 trumpets. And we know that the 7th trumpet, that's the prelude to the cups. So we'll talk more about that. Revelation chapter 9 and verse 1 says, "Then the 5th messenger sounded, and I saw a star fallen from heaven to earth." We'll see that star as a demon. "And to him was given the key to the bottomless pit." And people say, well, there is no bottomless pit here on earth, and you hear various theories about that. But we know that this star is a demon because continuing on in verse 2, it says, "And he," referring to the star, "opened the bottomless pit." Well, no star can do that. That has to be a being. "And smoke arose out of the pit, like the smoke of a great furnace. So the sun and the air were darkened because of the smoke of the pit." Verse 3, "Then out of the smoke locusts came upon the earth." This is the first woe. "And to them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power." And I didn't want to take time for it in this slide set, but we will see that the locusts may have something to do with Ishmael, as Ishmael is referred to as locusts other places in the Tanakh or in the Old Testament prophecies. So continuing to verse 4. "And they were commanded not to harm the grass of the earth, or any green thing, or any tree, but only those men who do not have the seal of Elohim on their foreheads." And this is a reference to the 144,000, which we saw as an inset chapter in between seal 6 and seal 7, where we had 12,000 sealed from every tribe. So this tells us that those who are sealed, members of the 144,000, they will be protected from harm at least until trumpet 5. But we don't know that they're going to make it all the way through because there's a future point in time where they'll be taken up to heaven. And we'll take a look at that as we go. But if we are sealed as the 144,000, we know we make it through at least until trumpet 5. Verse 5. And they, meaning the locusts, were not given authority to kill them, but to torment them for 5 months. Their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it strikes a man. And with regards to these 5 months, it's probably a literal 5 months, because if we take a principle of a day for a year or a day for 1,000 years, then we go far beyond the 7-year tribulation time frame, and that doesn't work. So continuing in verse 6, it says, "In those days men will seek death, but they will not find it. And they will desire to die, but death will flee from them." Verse 7, "And the shape of the locusts was like horses prepared for battle, and on their heads were crowns of something like gold, and their faces were like the faces of men." And various commentators have said that the rotor chop might appear to be a golden halo or something like that. And people have made various comments as to whether these are helicopters or drones. Again, we're just going to have to see. So verse 8, "They had hair like women's hair," which I interpret to mean that it's long, "and their teeth were like lions' teeth." And we see in other places that a lion is symbolic of Babylon. Verse 9, "And they had breastplates like the breastplates of iron," which is a symbol of Rome. So again, it's part of this Babylonian sequence. "And the sound of their wings," or the rotor chop, "was like the sound of chariots with many horses running into battle. They had tails like scorpions, and there were stings in their tails. Their power was to hurt men for 5 months." So again, many people believe this is a reference to drones or helicopters. We'll just have to see. So continuing to verse 11, "And they had as king over them the messenger of the bottomless pit, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, which means a destroying angel. But in Greek, he has the name Apollyon, which simply means destroyer." So we mentioned in earlier slide sets about Shiva, the destroyer. And this is where another indication that this may be a reference to Ishmael, or the Muslim people. Because we know that Hagar came from Egypt, and she also took a bride for her son Ishmael from Egypt. And we know that Hindu was one of the religions practiced in Egypt at that time. And in fact, there was a shrine at Mecca to Shiva the destroyer. So this they would worship with what they call a Hindu Shiva lingam stone. And we'll talk about that in some other place. But continuing on, verse 12 says, "One woe is past. Behold, still 2 more woes are coming after these things." So trumpet 5 has been the first woe, and then now we're going to see trumpet 6 become the second woe. So Revelation 9, starting in verse 13, it says, "Then the 6th messenger sounded, and I heard a voice from the 4 horns of the golden altar, which is before Elohim, saying to the 6th messenger who had the trumpet, 'Release the 4 messengers who are bound at the great river Euphrates.'" Verse 15, "So the 4 messengers who'd been prepared for the hour and the day and the month and the year were released to kill 1/3 of mankind. Now the number of the army of the horsemen was 200 million. I heard the number of them." So a couple of things where the messengers are released to kill 1/3 of mankind. This is why we don't believe that the earlier reference to trees refers to men, is because here we're told that 1/3 of mankind is going to be killed. Some more points. People oftentimes suggest, or they tell us, that the Chinese army is 200 million men. But again, where is the role of Ishmael in this? We have to also remember that right now the Muslims are taking over Europe as part of the Coudenhove-Kalergi plan. It's part of the Babylonian plan to basically turn Europe into what they call Eurabia, or it might also refer to 200 million demons. But one of the things that it shows us, again, is confirms to us that the New World Order, eventually their peace that is no peace, begins to fall apart during this time frame. Otherwise, the nations would not be fighting with each other. So continuing in verse 17. "And thus I saw the horses in the vision. Those who sat on them had breastplates of fiery red, hyacinth blue, and sulfur yellow. And the heads of the horses were like the heads of lions," which is another reference to the Babylonian sequence. "And out of their mouths came fire, smoke, and brimstone." By these three plagues, a third of mankind was killed. So again, a third of mankind was killed by the fire and the smoke and the brimstone which came out of their mouths. For their power is in their mouth and in their tails. For their tails are like serpents having heads, and with them they do great harm. But the rest of mankind, who were not killed by these plagues, did not repent of the works of their hands, that they should not worship demons and idols of gold, silver, brass, stone, and wood, which can neither see nor hear nor walk. So we're talking about a lot of things going on, but again, Yahweh is a loving Father. What he really wants is for mankind to repent. So like any loving father who disciplines his children, he steps the punishment slowly up and up and up and up, but it doesn't change because in verse 21 we read, "And they did not repent of their murders or their sorceries or their sexual immorality or their thefts." So what we've seen so far in trumpets 1 through 6, we're talking about a 7-year tribulation sequence. The first trump is hail, fire, and blood, or perhaps hail, fire, and water, perhaps symbolic of a comet. The second trump is a great mountain or a great government, which is thrown into the sea. The third trump is wormwood, which makes the waters bitter, and many men die from the water being bitter, and this could be a reference to men falling away from the faith. Then in the fourth trump, a third of the sun, the moon, and the stars were struck, and this may be a reference to a third of the believers in the three Abrahamic faiths. Now the fifth trump is different. We start to get into the woes, and this may be the second half of the tribulation. We don't know. This may be where the time of Jacob's trouble begins, but we don't know. We do know that locusts, probably oriented with Ishmael, torment men for 5 months. And then in the sixth trump, which is woe 2, we see a 200 million man army, and a third of mankind is killed. And that makes for the second woe. So referring back, just to keep everyone oriented, this again is the simplified version of the timeline chart. We've seen trumpets 1 through 6. In future slide sets, we're going to see and hear about 7 thunders. We're also going to hear about the 2 witnesses in chapter 11 in the next slide set. And we're building towards trumpet 7. And trumpet 7 is going to be a major event. Trumpet 7 is where Babylon is judged and Babylon begins to fall. There's a lot of other data. And then, trumpet 7, that's where judgment is passed. And then the 7 cups of judgment, or the 7 bowls of wrath, that's when those are going to be poured out upon Babylon. So I thank you for joining me. Please join me again for part 6, where we'll talk about the 2 witnesses. If you'd like to, you can also sign up for our free weekly newsletter, where we discuss news events in correspondence with the 4 horses at www.nazarenisrael.org. Shalom.